The Bethune House Migrant Women's Refuge is a community-driven shelter and registered charitable institution serving migrant workers in distress in Hong Kong. Established by the Mission for Migrant Workers or MFMW, Bethune House provides, aside from emergency shelter, food, and other forms of assistance, to enable migrant women in crisis to seek justice and achieve empowerment. We are more than a shelter. We transform victims to survivors. There are nearly 340,000 migrant domestic workers here in Hong Kong, of which majority are women, serve as an integral part of Hong Kong society. They care for their employers' families and households. They often work 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. Required to live in their employers' homes when their contracts are terminated. Where do they go? If it's the middle of the night, who they call for assistance? 3 years into the pandemic, migrant workers are feeling the impact. Flight bans on and off throughout the pandemic to their home countries have affected their ability to leave Hong Kong. Bethune House has sheltered record numbers of migrant workers in crisis. We have worked to ensure not one migrant domestic worker is left on the street. How did we get here? Let us look back to 36 years ago and even a bit more. In 1981, the Mission for Migrant Workers was established with support from Filipino churches to support the issues of Filipino migrant domestic workers here in Hong Kong. Cynthia and June Telias were sent from the Philippines to Hong Kong to provide paralegal help, to give advice, and companionship. From the early days, planning for a shelter began since it was obviously needed. Together with women from the Methodist International Church, Kowloon Union Church, and the Academe, Cynthia set up a committee to explore what could be done. Initially, they set up the alternative shelter scheme for ASHES, who would provide temporary shelter to a migrant worker at a time. Yet, it was clear an actual shelter was needed. With initial support coming from church-based organizations and groups from overseas, everything came together for the opening of the shelter. Around that time, the daughter of Cynthia and June Teles passed away, and the shelter was named in loving memory of their Bethune. On 21 September 1986, the Bethune House was officially opened. In the beginning, it was no more than a room to sleep in since there were still no beds, but it was safe. The work continued, and in 1989, Bethune House was able to hire its first permanent staff to live with the residents in the shelter. In 2011, the Bethune House had to move out of its rented flat in Kowloon. This opportunity was used to expand into 2 shelter spaces. The church offered a new space nearby the former location, and a new flat was found on Hong Kong Island that could be rented. When some of the founders look back, they describe how it has been wonderful to see new organizations involved in helping women and migrant domestic workers in distress. But they are also very aware that migrant domestic workers are facing many of the same problems today. Women coming to Bethune House from different backgrounds, but their needs are the same. They need to rest and regenerate after a stressful experience or illness. They need assistance and paralegal advice. They need a community to share their experiences and to help each other. They need to remember their strength and power after being mostly in a powerless situation. The Bethune House is a place where migrant workers from all nationalities stay together and learn from each other's experiences. Indonesians Eni Lestari and Irwiana Solisjaningsi are 2 former residents who were exploited and abused by their employers. They sought refuge in Bethune House. Both were provided with empowerment and recovery at the Bethune House. Both became leaders in the migrant domestic workers community and committed to working for the rights of all people. Eni Lestari is the chairperson of the International Migrants Alliance or IMA, She was the lone migrant worker invited to speak to the United Nations General Assembly in 2016. She spoke not just for herself but for all migrant domestic workers and is fighting for the rights into the present. Iluiana Solis Janings's case became popular after pictures of her abuse were published on social media. The support from the international community, including media and governments, forced the Hong Kong government to hear her case in court. She won her case against her abusive employer and continues to fight for all migrants. She was included in Time magazine's The 100 Most Influential People in 2014. No matter the challenges faced by migrant domestic workers, Bethune House, its staff and volunteers remain committed to providing a safe home and a community to shelter migrant workers in crisis. This commitment has not been without challenges throughout the 36 years. In 2018, when it was looking like we would unlikely be able to afford rent for the whole year on both our locations, it was individuals throughout the community that came together to help us save our shelter. Through donations, spreading the word, and connecting us with new funding sources, we were able to keep our doors open not just 2018 but into the present. When the global pandemic came in 2020, much like all of Hong Kong, Bethune House was faced with new challenges on how to protect the residents and continue its work serving the migrant worker community. Hundreds of migrant domestic workers were stranded due to flight cancellations and mandatory hotel quarantine on arrival, left new workers in hotel quarantine without enough food or other necessities, are just two examples of struggles faced during the pandemic. Bethune House opened its doors to as many workers as we safely could before ensuring others were safely housed in other shelters or hostels, while also providing food packs for migrants in hotel quarantine. Then early this year, the fifth wave of COVID-19 hit Hong Kong. Bethune House was not exempt from being affected, with reports of the migrant domestic workers being terminated and kicked out of their employer's home for being positive with COVID-19, we converted one of our shelters into a temporary accommodation for domestic workers who are COVID-19 positive for isolation before government facilities can be arranged. Joining with the Mission for Migrant Workers, MFMW, the Asian Migrants Coordinating Body, AMCV, and the Asia Pacific Mission for Migrants, APMM, we combined our efforts to meet the needs of the migrant domestic workers community. With the blessing of and volunteers donating their time, we deliver care packs including food, hygiene items, rapid antigen test kits, and other needs to domestic workers who were COVID-19 positive. With the support from HKEX and the YMCA, we were able to meet the demand for COVID-19 negative migrant domestic workers who were in need of shelter, especially for those who came from the isolation facilities but have had their contracts terminated. These are just the most recent examples of how it takes a community to shelter a migrant in need. With the support of fellow migrants, community partners, volunteers, the board members, and the community, we remain committed to providing a home away from home for migrant workers in crisis for years to come.